The street lights of Washington Heights flickered against the damp pavement, casting long shadows as Officer Matt Reynolds cruised through the quiet neighborhood. It was late, too late for a car like that to be rolling through here. His eyes locked on a sleek black sedan, the kind that screamed money, power, or trouble. He tailed it for a block, then another, watching how smoothly it moved, how confidently it weaved through the streets. Something about it didn't sit right. His fingers tightened around the wheel. He flipped on his lights. The sedan glided to a stop. Matt stepped out, adjusting his belt, the weight of his badge grounding him. He approached the driver's window, already assuming the worst. The tinted glass rolled down, revealing Dr. Naomi Carter, a striking black woman in a sharp navy suit, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. "License and registration?" Matt demanded, his voice edged with authority. She handed them over without hesitation. No stutter, no nervous fumbling, just calm. "This your car?" he pressed, scanning the documents. "Yes." Her tone was smooth, controlled. She didn't ask why he stopped her, she didn't flinch, and that irritated him. "What brings you to this part of town?" She raised a brow, her gaze locking onto his. "Is that relevant, officer?" Something in her tone, measured, confident, set him off. He'd pulled over plenty of people who knew their place, who nodded, apologized, complied. But this woman? Too much self-assurance, too much control. His jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped. She didn't argue, didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped out, standing tall, her heels clicking against the pavement. "I need to search your trunk." Under what probable cause? Matt's grip on his belt tightened. "Step back." She didn't. That was it. That flicker of defiance, that unwillingness to shrink. Before he knew it, his hand moved, a sharp, open palm slap across her face. The crack of it echoed through the night. For a moment, everything stilled. Her head turned slightly with the force, her cheek flaming red against the glow of the streetlights. But she didn't step back, she didn't stumble, she didn't cry out. She just turned her eyes back to him, cold, steady, unwavering. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Someone whispered, "You just hit the wrong person." Phones were up, screens were glowing. Matt's chest heaved, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. But, he smirked, he'd done this before, a dozen times, and every time he walked away clean. This time would be no different. Or so he thought. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Dr. Naomi Carter's wrists, but her face remained unreadable. She sat in the back of Officer Matt Reynolds' cruiser, her silence more unnerving than any outburst. Matt gripped the wheel tighter than necessary as he sped toward the precinct, his mind spinning. The slap had felt right in the moment, like a reset, putting her in her place. But something about the way she stared back, unshaken, unbothered, sent an itch down his spine. He pushed the thought aside. He had dealt with plenty of people like her before, cocky, self-righteous, thinking they could talk their way out of anything. She was no different. Or so he thought. As he pulled into the precinct lot, the street was already buzzing. Protesters? No. Just too many people watching. More than usual. He ignored the unease twisting in his gut and yanked Naomi out of the car, gripping her arm tighter than necessary. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The precinct, normally a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, barking officers, and radio chatter, went dead silent. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto Naomi. A clipboard slipped from a rookie's hands, clattering onto the floor. A desk sergeant, mid-coffee sip, froze, his hand trembling. Then, a hushed whisper. "Holy shit, that's Dr. Naomi Carter." Matt's smirk faltered. He shoved her forward, clearing his throat, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. His voice carried through the stillness, but no one moved. A veteran officer, one Matt had worked with for years, subtly stepped back, away from him. The captain's office door slammed open. Captain James Holloway stormed out, his normally composed face drained of color, his jaw tight. "Uncuff her. Now." Matt's stomach twisted. "Captain, she—" "Now, Reynolds." For the first time in his career, Matt hesitated. He wasn't in control. Naomi, still calm, still standing tall, hadn't said a word. She didn't have to. The station phones started ringing. 1, 2, then a dozen. Officers scrambled as messages flooded in. "The mayor's on the line. The governor's office just called." "Jesus Christ, it's everywhere." Matt's breathing turned shallow. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He looked at Naomi, her wrists still cuffed, but her presence unbreakable. Then Captain Holloway stepped closer, voice low and lethal. "You stupid son of a beatach. Do you even know who you just slapped?" Matt didn't answer. He couldn't, because reality was crashing down too fast, too hard, and it was just getting started. The morning after Officer Matt Reynolds walked into the precinct with Dr. Naomi Carter in cuffs, the world had already changed, and not in his favor. His phone buzzed relentlessly, notifications stacking up like a countdown to disaster. The video was everywhere. News stations looped it on repeat, analysts dissecting every frame. Protesters flooded the streets outside the precinct, their voices rising in fury. Matt sat in the break room, arms crossed, jaw clenched, watching the footage play out on the news. "An outrageous abuse of power," the anchor declared. "Officer Reynolds is now under investigation for excessive force." His stomach twisted. Investigation? They were acting like this was some big scandal, like he hadn't done this kind of thing before. A sharp knock on the door. Captain James Holloway. "My office." "Now." Matt followed, heart hammering. The moment the door shut, Holloway tossed a file onto the desk. Matt's personnel file. "You're suspended, effective immediately." The words hit harder than a punch. "What?" "Shut the hell up and listen." Holloway's voice was cold, controlled rage. "The mayor's pissed, the governor's calling for your badge, the feds are sniffing around. You're done." Matt shook his head. "It was just a slap. She's the chief of police, you idiot. And guess what? You've got a file thicker than a damn phone book." Holloway leaned in, eyes dark. "They're digging, Matt, and you left them a gold mine." His throat went dry. "Complaints? Excessive force reports? A couple lost body cam incidents?" Holloway let the words sink in. "You're not just losing your badge. You're about to get buried." Matt's hands curled into fists. "So, that's it? You're just cutting me loose?" Holloway scoffed. "I'd throw you to the wolves myself if it meant keeping this department out of the fire. Now get out of my office." Matt stormed out, past officers who wouldn't meet his eyes. Men who used to have his back now acted like they didn't know him. Outside, the protests were louder, bigger. Signs waved. "Justice for Naomi Carter." "Fire Reynolds." A brick smashed through his car window. His breathing quickened. Then came the headline that sealed his fate. Federal investigation launched into Officer Matt Reynolds. His pulse spiked as the anchor spoke. "Sources say a previously closed hit-and-run case involving a black teenager is being reopened, and Officer Reynolds may be implicated." His hands trembled. They were coming for him. Not just for the slap. For everything. And for the first time, Matt Reynolds felt something he never had before. Fear. The night air was thick with the sound of chanting. "Justice for Naomi Carter. Read-alls must pay." Officer Matt Reynolds sat in his dimly lit living room, the blue glow of the news flashing across his face. His phone was useless, blown up with threats, reporters and former colleagues dodging his calls. Outside, a growing crowd pressed against the barricades set up around his house. His address had leaked online. He gritted his teeth. How the hell did it come to this? Just days ago, he was in control. He was the one making arrests, calling the shots. Now, he was the hunted. A sudden crash shattered the tense air, glass exploding across the floor. Matt flinched, his breath catching in his throat. A brick lay in the middle of his living room, a crumpled note taped to its side. Racist pig. His hands trembled as he tossed it aside. He stormed toward the window, but the moment he peeped through the blinds, a camera flash went off. They were watching. The TV cut to breaking news. His gut clenched as the anchor's voice rang out. Federal investigators have reopened a 2016 hit-and-run case involving Officer Matt Reynolds. New evidence suggests Reynolds may have been involved in covering up the death of 17-year-old Jordan Miller. Matt's blood ran cold. Authorities are also reviewing excessive force complaints dating back a decade. His heart pounded. They weren't just going after him for the slap. They were digging everything up. He grabbed his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. A voice answered. "Ray, I need help." Ray Daniels, his old partner, someone who knew how to bury things. There was a pause. Then, "Meet me at the old warehouse. Midnight." Matt exhaled sharply. This was it, his way out. But as he reached for his gun, he heard it. Tires screeching outside. Red and blue lights flared through his window. His chest tightened. No, not yet. Then came the pounding on his door. "FBI, open up." His fingers twitched over his pistol. Run, fight, surrender. His world was collapsing, faster than he could outrun it. And for the first time in his life, he realized. There was nowhere left to hide. Matt Reynolds gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he tore down the empty highway. His heart pounded like a war drum. He had barely escaped his house before the FBI stormed in. If he had hesitated a second longer, he'd already be in cuffs. Now his only hope lay in Ray Daniels, his old partner, the only man who still owed him something. The warehouse loomed ahead, a rusted skeleton of its former self, tucked away at the city's edge. Matt pulled in, headlights off, sweat slicking his palms. He stepped out, his breath fogging in the cold air. Ray was already there, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. "You look like hell," Ray muttered, flicking a cigarette onto the ground. "Yeah, well, I've had a rough week," Matt snapped. "What's the plan? You got an escape route?" Ray exhaled slowly, then reached into his truck, pulling out a duffel bag. "Here, cash, burner phone, new ID. You take this, get out of town and lay low." Matt's fingers twitched as he unzipped the bag, then his stomach dropped. Stacked between the bills were bricks of cocaine. He snapped his head up. "What the hell is this, Ray?" Ray's expression didn't change. "Your way out." Matt's pulse hammered in his ears. This wasn't a lifeline. It was a setup. His mind raced. Ray had flipped, probably cut a deal with the feds. They were framing him for drug trafficking. Matt's breath came fast, shallow. His hand inched toward his gun. Ray saw it. His eyes darkened. "I wouldn't, if I were you." Then, flashing lights. The warehouse flooded with red and blue as FBI agents swarmed in, guns raised. "Down on the ground, Reynolds. Hands behind your head." Matt froze. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Ray stepped back, hands raised. "Told you, man," he muttered. "You were always too damn reckless." Matt slowly lowered to his knees. Cold steel locked around his wrists. As they dragged him toward the waiting squad car, the reality hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just over. He had been played, just like every victim he ever silenced. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, protesters, former colleagues, victims. Everyone had come to see Matt Reynolds fall. He sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the crisp suit surrounding him. His hands were cuffed, his jaw clenched. His attorney Ethan Harrow leaned in, voice hushed. "We plead not guilty. We spin the slap as a misunderstanding. Self-defense, maybe. The drug charges, we blame Ray." "There's still a way out." Matt barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Dr. Naomi Carter, who sat calmly in the front row. She wasn't just here to watch. She was the reason he was here. The judge entered, a gavel slammed. And then the onslaught began. The case against him. The prosecution didn't just present evidence, they buried him in it. The slap played over and over on the courtroom screen. His record: stacks of excessive force complaints, racial profiling reports, body cam footage mysteriously disappearing. The reopened hit and run, evidence that Matt had covered up the death of Jordan Miller, 17, black, unarmed. The drug bust, Ray Daniels testified, sealing Matt's fate. Every new piece of evidence felt like a hammer to his skull. Then came the final blow. Naomi Carter takes the stand. She stepped up, composed, powerful, deliberate. "I didn't come here today just as chief of police. I came as a black woman, as a citizen who has watched people like Matt Reynolds escape justice for years. But today, we say, no more." Her words sliced through the air. Matt's stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of the jury's eyes shifting. The verdict. The jury didn't deliberate long. When they returned, the foreman's voice was sharp, final. Guilty on all counts. Matt barely heard the rest. His ears rang, his breath shallow. Then the judge spoke. "Matt Reynolds, for your crimes, including civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy, you are sentenced to 20 years, no parole." The courtroom erupted, cheers, rage, camera flashes. Matt's mind spun. 20 years. His life was over. As he was led away, he locked eyes with Naomi one last time. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded. Because this wasn't just justice. This was his reckoning. The steel doors slammed shut behind Matt Reynolds, sealing his fate. He shuffled forward, wrists cuffed, clad in an orange jumpsuit that stripped him of the power he once wielded. The air inside Eastern State Penitentiary was thick with sweat, fear, and the unspoken rules of survival. The moment he stepped onto the tier, all eyes were on him. Not with respect, not with fear, but recognition. Men he had arrested, faces he had bruised, names he had long forgotten. But they had never forgotten him. A towering inmate with a jagged scar across his jaw leaned against the bars, smirking. "Well, well, if it ain't Officer Reynolds." Laughter rippled through the block. Matt kept his head high, refusing to show weakness. He had been a cop for 10 years. He knew how to play the game. Or so he thought. Day 1, the first lesson. In the yard he moved carefully. He kept his back against the wall, eyes scanning every face, every movement. It didn't take long. A shove from behind, a punch to his gut, a knee to his ribs, fast, brutal, efficient. He hit the dirt, coughing, gasping for air. No guards intervened. He wasn't one of them anymore. Month 3, no more protection. Inside, the abuse continued. His food was tampered with, his bunk ransacked. At night, whispers of old grudges filled the air. He went to a guard, a man who once patrolled the same streets with him. "I need protective custody." The guard smirked. "You remember 17, traffic stop, you shoved me against my own car and called it resisting. No PC for you, Reynolds." Matt's stomach sank. There was no escape. Year 15, release, but no freedom. 15 years later, his sentence was reduced for good behavior. A cruel joke. Because he had survived, but he was already dead inside. He walked out of the gates, older, thinner, broken. No family waiting, no home to return to. Just a duffel bag, a bus ticket, and a name the world had come to hate. He thought he could disappear. He thought he could outrun what he had done. Until that night. The final reckoning. A dark alley, a shadowed figure stepping into his path. The man was young, strong, a face Matt didn't recognize. But the voice was familiar. "You don't remember me, do you?" Matt's blood ran cold. The man took a slow step forward. "I was 12 when you slapped my mother." And before Matt could react, the baton swung. The last thing he saw was Naomi Carter, watching from the shadows. She didn't stop it. She didn't have to. Because justice had finally come full circle. Justice has a way of catching up with those who believe they are untouchable. Matt Reynolds spent years abusing his power, convinced that his badge shielded him from consequences. He was wrong. This story isn't just about one corrupt officer. It's about a system that enabled him. A system that looked the other way until one woman, Dr. Naomi Carter, refused to be silenced. She didn't just fight back for herself. She fought for every victim who had been ignored, dismissed, or brutalized. Matt's downfall wasn't just because of a single mistake. It was years in the making. This is a reminder that accountability matters, that power, when abused, will eventually crumble under the weight of its own corruption. What do you think? Did Matt deserve his fate, or did the system make him this way? Drop a comment below. Hit that like button if you believe in real justice. Subscribe for more gripping, real-world stories that challenge the way we see power, justice, and truth. Because in the end, no one is above the law.